Hi everyone, welcome to my paper, Into the Multiverse, Racial Gaslighting Off-World. It's an arts humanities approach to thinking about imposter syndrome via a debate on microaggressions. It was also presented as part of Kingston University's symposium on, I think uh, it was a storytelling conference. So it was the Festival of the Story, if you wanted to Google search that as well. Anyhow, let's begin. Since the anti-racism protest in 2020, many of my friends, colleagues, and even students at the time who were talking about this have routinely said how the word microaggression now just minimalizes their effects. Physicists describe physicists describe subatomic particles as particles than an atom, smaller than an atom, or inside an atom. In 2023, I came to develop Chester Pierce's theorization of microaggressions uh, to develop that using popular culture. So I came to subatomic racism to describe particle level terrorism, giving a mental image and a way to show the depths to which they operate. But it was actually Ant-Man and talk of a subatomic dimension that inspired this, not quantum mechanics or physics. Marvel's pin particles, Marvel's pin particles that enable Ant-Man to enter the subatomic realm, a place that renders time and space irrelevant, is not so dissimilar to how microaggressions distort human senses of placemaking. Carl Sagan also argued the worlds within our bodies are made of stuff. So I began to think about our bodies and the cells and the organs and things inside it as a universe too. These fictions may give rise to six cosmic metaphors, infinity stones, controlling vital parts of existence, so time, soul, space, reality, power, and the mind. I explore in other papers that you can find on this channel. Today's paper focuses on Marvel's Mind Stone as a metaphor for the impact of imposter syndrome or the intentional systematic effects of gaslighting with a focus on Black experiences. Thinking about racial gaslighting then, as a not so microaggression, I think about subatomic racism as the road microaggressions must travel down to get into our bodies. It's a work in progress. Through the Mind Stone, then, this paper explores this metaphor and some of its effects. Imposter syndrome is a psychological experience where individuals doubt their skills, talents, or even achievement while actually being quite successful in their chosen area of study. There's a constant feeling of being a fraud. This is not specific. This is not a racial experience specifically. Although when I was a student union officer between July 2019 and June 2020, most of the students and staff that were coming to me with this um, were Black women. However, the idea of a syndrome blames individuals, absolving institutions of any responsibility whatsoever. Resilience packages are rolled out across university training provisions, teaching people to see these issues as individual and not collective, societal, or even imposed by wider social problems, of like what Bell Hooks wrote about through large parts of our work as white supremacist, imperialist, patriarchy. And that's the short version as well. I'll put a link to her work in the description, as she did in books like Black Looks and also Outlaw Culture as well. The individual is made into a failure by the institution and told just to be more confident, as if it's like easy. Put another way, we might think about imposter syndrome and the internalized hatred it causes as an intentional byproduct of systematic gaslighting, which comes with misogynistic dimensions for Black women. As Graham Kunani writes in Living While Black, gaslighting is a kind of emotional abuse in which perpetrators seek to gain power over the victim by making them doubt their thoughts, memories, or feelings. Marvel's Mind Stone brought me to its effects as a metaphor. We first see it in 2012's Avengers as central to Loki's scepter, gaining him or granting him many abilities, including mind control and greater powers of influence over others. By the sequel, Age of Ultron, it had fallen into the hands of espionage agency, so fascist espionage agency Hydra, where scientist Baron Strucker uses it to experiment on twin metahumans Pietro and Wanda Maximoff. Taking the scepter from Hydra, Tony Stark and Bruce Banner start using it to play with the idea of an AI peacekeeping program, but end up making supervillain Ultron, who later steals the scepter from them, kills Strucker, and later weaponizes the twins against the Avengers. Wanda's abilities include the ability to make reality. When the Avengers confront Ultron, she uses her powers to insert, fake memories into the Avengers' brains, ultimately culminating in a split team, and they start fighting against each other and so forth, culminating in a battle between Iron Man and the Hulk in the middle of Cape Town, South Africa. So you might see how the Mind Stone metaphor might be a way to think of how the effects of gaslighting distort perceptions of reality should we experience enough of them. It makes those most affected to doubt their minds. Further, how employers, for example, exploit this fact, enforcing cultures of compliance. We may also see this in context of home and settings of domestic abuse and violence, from the physical to the covert financial abuse, etc., etc. Forensic social worker and sociologist Evan Starks, in his book Coercive Control, may be a good place to start thinking about the domesticated relationship between institutions and employees. Coercive control may speak to how institutions built on power, hierarchy, and compliance, very much in Foucault's ideas of the prison, discipline and punishment, and so on, may work against those who speak out, since speaking out would always act like a chink in the armor of power. The way institutions silence complainers are very perverse forms of gaslighting, including turning colleagues against each other. Other things might include demotions, pay cuts, so financial abuse, threats of redundancy, but not actually carrying out that act, so to keep you scared and anxious and so forth, and really other psychological mind games to keep you compliant, anxious, and in their control. Gaslighting as a tool of compliance dependent capitalist workplaces may be part of the performed everydayness of white supremacy. The microaggressions Black staff experience are part of the normalization of white supremacy. Seeing as many HR departments and also where many white women work trying to influence white men, this might show how they also tell us why the main beneficiaries of higher education policy making, for example, have been white women, and why white women managers continue to harm Black staff. Should you complain, you might be asked if it really happened. And that's when microaggressions and gaslighting become entangled. Microaggressions set the trap. Gaslighting springs the trap, and it is persistent and unrelenting. Imposter syndrome is often the nice liberal phrase for this experience, where it is the unofficial policy to maintain structures of power. Black students, for example, writing excellent essays only to have their ideas stolen by the lecturers, and I've seen this happen, is one example. Are you sure that's your work? You might be told. When you complain, or when the student complains, the institution silences the student. Many senior scholars are protected by the virtue of their position. In heritage spaces, for example, as well, like at country houses, this may look differently. As many country houses were financed by empire money, we might come to see how these spaces carry a spiritual energy that pushes we Black people away, that it doesn't do as much to our white middle class peers. Current debates about our access to country houses have talked a lot about physical racism, but less so about the spirit of race, of spaces, places, buildings, and how these might be haunted by white supremacy. I came to think about this in terms of a Black British psychogeography and how, while the Black presence disrupts these spaces, the ghosts of enslavers may push us away. In my culture, so the Caribbean cultures of Jamaica and Grenada, we call these evil spirits Duppy. Bob Marley's song Duppy Conqueror explores that further. Building as buildings as living entities may come to spellcast the worst of their occupants, the worst behaviors of their occupants. Historic spaces absorb that power in one time and then radiating it in another, which is what happened in HBO's Lovecraft Country, where the ghosts of slavery haunt the occupants of one house in Jim Crow America. I guess it's the 1950s or the 1960s. We come to see how spirit passes from buildings into people. In the words of Sorcerer Wong from Doctor Strange, while heroes like the Avengers fight physical dangers, we sorcerers fight more mystical. How Black people may walk into a space haunted by the feelings that live there is as much a Black psychogeography, so a space, how spaces play on Black emotions, as it is a Black hauntology, how Black history comes back reanimated as a ghost. Today's conversations of Black access to the countryside and country estates have not really asked this question. Just because we can diversify, does that mean we should? We might come to think about racial gaslighting that way, and how spaces come to take on the worst of those who dominate them, akin to whiteness as enchantment, and what I call in my paper on the Soul Stone as an anthropomorphic whiteness. How inanimate objects like buildings take on human-made behaviors of whiteness, so racist spellcasting. Our brains may start to loop, as many of ours do when met with persistent terror. This is how I came to think about entropy and Christopher Nolan's film Tenet. According to what I know to be true, which could be completely wrong as well, because I'm not a physicist and I'm not trained in science in that sense, entropy's relationship with time makes a barrier. Traveling backwards in time clashes with the laws of thermodynamics. Don't ask me about physics, but what they say is entropy is a closed object, which means time can only flow in one direction, forward, apparently. There are theories that challenge entropy or reverse it, which is what happens in Tenet. What happens in Tenet is machines are being made that challenge the direction of time for objects and people, in effect, mixing directions in the same scene. For example, while a bullet might be dropped from a hand onto a table, Tenet's reversing of entropy inverts the bullet, arriving into your hand at your will. So lots of Tenet is in fact a palindrome. It works the same going forwards as it does going backwards. While I'm not looking for science, I'm looking for linguistic freedom that can illustrate certain kinds of feelings, and that's how I came to think about racial entropy as a way for thinking about how racial gaslighting simulates that time travel adjacent looping and the disordered state, or yeah, in that sense. We might also come to see gaslighting as something that's lived in rather than an event level incident. Christopher Nolan argues we don't have to see cause and effect as one before the other. Could we think about racism that way as well? The way physical acts of racism later linger in our thoughts comes to show how racism reproduces itself in our memories, minds, as copies, doing damage. As much as we see racism is a white people's problem, we as victims must retain control of our thoughts, since thoughts can shape realities for good or for ill. We can then internalize those feelings, and then the looping thoughts start. The ways racism implants itself in our minds shows microaggressions certainly have an afterlife. The looping, what I call racial entropy, gives racism license to split into what Boris DeWitt talked about as splitting our local world on Earth into myriads of copies of itself. I mean, what he's saying there in that quote is that for multiverse to exist, that every action, no matter how microscopic, that also push its effects through a universe, including human organic matter. Here, I'm not so interested about the mathematics or the science of the multiverse, but more the metaphor of splitting and how racial violence can be felt physically as much as non-physical, the metaphysical, so how it splits itself within us. How racism affects ideas of time and space as much as it does our conscious or our unconscious mind. So very metaphysical. So the Infinity Stones are perhaps a metaphor for thinking about microaggressions as this particle level terror, working through various dimensions, not all of them explainable, through a common sense worldview of what is objectively seen, but also what is felt. 6 stones for 6 ways microaggressions harm. Together they can wreak havoc as much through time as they do through space, flesh, the spirit, the mind, and so on. Interdimensional microaggressions. Although scholars have written on this, I just thought Marvel would be an interesting way to come at it. What I'm talking about is how a genocide-like violence is enacted on individuals when the organic world in our bodies is being destroyed as much as the outside organic world as well, like the environment. Racism is as much about physical violence as it is about metaphysical, where although these parallel racisms exist, they cannot communicate, or can they? This multiverse of white supremacy is a metaphor. What would Hill Collins's matrix of domination look like at a microscopic level, further pushing those ideas into notions of time, space, the spirit, and so forth as well? In closing, humans are cosmic beings, and the Infinity Stones I came to think about as metaphors for various ways racism operates. Imposter syndrome, gaslighting, whatever you want to call it, came to symbolize the Mind Stone. The effects of gaslighting are one dimension of many. Thanks very much. And as always, if you've got comments, questions, and so forth, you can send me an email, tradeventour.com/contact, or leave it in the comment section. Thanks very much.